What's going on YouTube? It's Rowan here again with another video. This time I'm going to be talking about Gardevoir and specifically why Gardevoir beats Lost Tina. Now, a lot of people have been talking about this online. We saw the Bradner-Gearhart debate, and Bradner ended up taking it down, but I don't think that was very representative of how the matchup goes, with some different play patterns and some different deck list choices. I think it goes down a little differently. So, just to get into what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about the advantage of losing and all the comeback combos that are involved in this matchup, some of the deck list choices I make in my deck, and why I think they're very important for this matchup. I'm going to talk about the passive approach from Tina, and then I'm also going to talk about the aggressive approach from Tina. After that, I'm going to talk about some resource management tips and come to a conclusion. So first of all, the advantage of losing, I mean, some of it is very obvious. You know, you have cards like Roxanne, Iono, Countercatcher, Reversal, which only work when you hit a certain threshold with Roxanne, and only work when you're behind with Reversal and Countercatcher. Iono, you can use whenever, but it's really strongest when you're losing, and especially when you're losing by more and more prize cards. So the comeback combos that Gardevoir are going to employ: Reversal Arcana, that's going to be able to take big KOs on Tina. Cresselia Countercatcher. Now, sometimes the Countercatcher is not even necessary. Sometimes just Cresselia is really frustrating for Tina to deal with if they're attacking with Cramorant. But if they're not attacking with Cramorant, you can always Countercatcher in Radiant Greninja and Cresselia kill things on the bench, whether it's a Sableye or a Comfey, especially Comfeys with energies. I love to kill those with Cresselia. And then, of course, Iono is just always a great card in the matchup. Then for Tina, you have Roxanne Path and Countercatcher Sableye. Now, Roxanne Path is great. However, it can only be used once you're at 3 prizes. So you actually have some counterplay with this, and I'll get into that more later. But generally, you're going to be wanting to go from 4 prizes to 2, and then from 2 to 0, which is going to mean taking out back-to-back Tinas, and you're just going to want to be setting up for that during the rest of the game. The Countercatcher Sableye play is good, and they can combo with Roxanne Path. However, most of the time, you're going to have a Jirachi on the bench. I think every Gardevoir deck should have a Jirachi in their deck at this point. Without Jirachi, this matchup's completely different. So for the rest of the video, I'm going to be talking as if you are playing a Jirachi in your Gardevoir deck, because you really should be. Now that I've talked about the comeback combos that these decks use, I want to talk about the draw engines, and specifically the way Iono and Colress interact. Now, with the Lost Zone engine, you're using Comfey and Colress, and you're constantly drawing cards off the top of your deck and putting the best ones into your hand. Now, the reason Iono lines up so nicely into this draw engine is because as a Lost Zone player builds up their hand, they have several Colress or Mirage Gates or a bunch of resources, and you play Iono, and they all go to the bottom of the deck. And this is even worse than just a judge shuffling them in, because they're guaranteed to not redraw those cards, which means that they have to draw some way to shuffle their deck, like a Nest Ball or a Super Odd, or else all the Colresses that were in their hand before are going to be trapped on the bottom of their deck. Additionally, the Gardevoir draw engine is more long-lasting because, as using the Kirlia engine, you're constantly putting bad cards into the discard for free, whereas with the Lost Zone engine, you need to be using switch cards, jet energies, retreat to activate a Comfey every time, and every time you Comfey, there's a possibility that you run into 2 good cards and have to pitch a resource into the Lost Zone. So this means that as the game goes on, the Gardevoir deck, their deck becomes more filtered, all their good cards and resources remain, whereas with the Lost Zone deck, it's much more volatile. Now I'm going to talk about my deck list, some of the card choices, and which cards I think are the most impactful in this Lost Tina matchup. Now, right away, you'll see Jirachi is on there. I'm not going to talk about this card too much because I think everyone kind of knows why this card is good. Prevent Sableye, especially when you're going to be looking to take those big knockouts with Shining Arcana and you're putting a bunch of damage on it. You don't want them to take a 2-prize turn, so it's really important to have Jirachi on the board. Additionally, it's essential to have this just to protect your Kirlias. The biggest theme in this matchup is going to be maintaining a strong board so that you're able to continue to play the game. And Jirachi is really the best card at protecting your Kirlias, because otherwise they die really efficiently to Sableye. Additionally, the Collapse Stadium and Professor Turo scenario are really important to be able to pick up damaged Pokemon and also get rid of Pokemon you don't want anymore. So sometimes you'll come across situations where you need to use Radiant Greninja in the early game to draw cards, or you need Manaphy to protect yourself from Greninja, and then later in the game, maybe a Water Energy enters the Lost Zone, or all your Kirlias have become Gardevoirs and you no longer want this Manaphy on your bench. It can kind of clog your board, and you really just want to have as many Psychic Pokemon as possible. And part of the reason you want so many Psychic Pokemon is so that you can use Cresselia effectively. Now, when I watched the Bradner Gearhart game, I saw Gearhart using Cresselia to put 80 damage on a Lost Tina a couple of times, and that was pretty bad, honestly. What you need to be doing is you need to be poking for 100 damage with the Cresselia so that you can clean it up later with the Gardevoir EX. That's really what you want to be doing when you're poking Tinas. Otherwise, you just got to be killing Comfuse. Another thing you'll notice is that there's 4 path outs, 5 if you count the PAL pad for the worker. Path can be really annoying. Sometimes you just lose the game because of a random path on turn 3 and you miss an attack, and that sucks. Some extra potential card inclusions, you see Battle VIP, the Mew, the Deoxys. These cards all kind of go together in my opinion, as the main purpose for Deoxys VSTAR is for that Miraidon matchup. It's for dodging Iron Hands, or not necessarily dodging the Iron Hands, but knocking it out. And to be able to knock out the Iron Hands, you need to have Deoxys down turn 1, which favors the Battle VIP pass build as you can set up more basics. Now, I don't particularly care about the Miraidon matchup. I don't think very many people are playing the deck right now. I don't think it's very well positioned. I just have a general level of disrespect for Miraidon, so I don't want to be playing this Deoxys card, which kind of leans me into my whole build, because when I'm not playing Deoxys, the VIPs make less sense, and then Mew is obviously not going in my deck either. Another note about the Celebrations Mew is that it's actually very bad against the Tina matchup. Not only does it have small HP, but it also just clogs your bench for the whole game, which can get pretty annoying. Especially when you're trying to fit Pokemon like Jirachi and Manaphy on your board, in addition to as many routes as possible. This Mew often just replaces a Kirlia, which is really bad. So, with all these obstacles that Tina has to overcome, there's 2 approaches they usually take. First of all, I'm going to talk about the passive approach. Some of the advantages of playing slow using Abyss Seeking on the early turns is that you can use Shred to take knockouts instead of Cramorant. Now, this is significant because Shred can knock out Cresselia, and Cramorant can't, which means that as you're getting Iono'd in the middle of the game, you need less to be able to kill these Cresselias, which in turn means it's harder for Gardevoir to stabilize their board. This also means that you can get to Sableye as soon as possible, and sometimes you can even set up a board lock where your opponent uses Mirage Step, they fill out their board with a bunch of purple guys and a Manaphy, and they have no Jirachi, and now you can start ripping apart their Kirlias with Lost Mine. Additionally, sometimes if you just use Abyss Seeking, you can actually bait your opponent into taking the lead. Now, I see a lot of people fall for this, so if you're playing Gardevoir and your opponent's kind of just chilling there, using Abyss Seeking, not really knocking anything out, one of my favorite things to do is to just come in with a Gardevoir EX with 2 energies and 1 Psychic Embrace so that it can't be loss impacted, and you can just punch that Tina for 190. Now, this is really nice because A, you don't go ahead on prizes, which is a huge liability in my opinion as a Gardevoir player to go ahead. And then 2, you set up this Tina for an easy knockout later in the game. You know, you can make a cool play later where you like Countercatcher and a Greninja, Iono, and then you can Cresselia for 100 and clean up that Tina. Some of the disadvantages of playing this Abyss Seeking slower approach is that Gardevoir has time to set up whatever they want, which means that if they know what's up, they'll just kind of sit there, they won't rush into any knockouts, they'll set up as many Kirlias as possible and thin their deck, and really you'll be in a lot of trouble for the rest of the game if they can do whatever they want. Especially problematic cards are Jirachi, Turo, and Collapsed because they can prevent you from Sablying, which is the biggest upside of this slower approach. Now, if you are playing Tina and you know your Gardevoir opponent isn't playing Jirachi, maybe you didn't see it game 1, maybe they're your friend, maybe they told you for some reason, that is when this approach becomes really strong because they can't protect themselves from Sableye, so they don't have like the ultimate end game. In Magic, people often talk about one deck being the control deck and one deck being like the aggressive deck. And in Pokemon, Gardevoir is a perfect example of always being the control deck. If the game goes long, Gardevoir is always favored. If your opponent is having a slow start and you're using Mirage Step, you're going to have great payoff in the end game, and their decks usually cap out lower. Now that we've talked about the upsides and the downsides of the passive approach, I'm going to talk about the aggressive approach. And personally, as a Gardevoir player, when my Lost Tina opponent is aggressive, it's much more worrying to me. If they take a turn or 2 to use Abyss Seeking, they try to set up for some kind of Sableye play, it really just allows you a lot of time to set up a near perfect board state, get a bunch of Kirlias going, and you're going to have an advantage in the end game. So with that in mind, how do we sustain aggression? Well, the number one thing is to not worry about the prize trade. We are not a prize trading deck. Our deck is built to fall behind. So when your opponent starts getting aggressive with Cramorant, this is okay. The number one thing we're going to be wanting to do is set up a lot of Kirlias and then protect them. And the way we're going to protect our Kirlias is by not attacking with them using Manaphy to protect us from Greninja, and using Jirachi to protect us from Sableye. So how do we want to actually use these cards? It's important to think about this and be intentional when you bench Manaphy and Jirachi. Manaphy, you want to bench on the second turn of the game to prevent your opponent from pulling off a ninja play, as they can feasibly do it on their second turn of the game. Jirachi is a bit of a later card, maybe turn 3 or 4. I typically like to put this card down after my Mirage Step gets KO'd, and it usually replaces that Kirlia. Now, the other thing to think about is how good Cresselia is at protecting your Kirlia. Now, this may sound like a weird idea, like, oh, Cresselia doesn't actually protect your Kirlia, but it does, in that when you attack with Cresselia, you keep all your Kirlias on the bench, you put a healthy Pokemon in the active, it can't be knocked out by Cramorant, and it buys you time. And time is what you need to set up more Kirlias. So sometimes you're going to come in with Crest, you're going to Iono, and they're just going to spit innocently into your Crest, which is incredible. You gain so much time, and it really just allows you to mount your comeback early. Another cool play you can make with the Cresselia is that you can put 100 damage onto a Tina V at some point in the game, which can then be cleaned up later by a Miracle Force. And the reason these plays work so well together is because Cresselia allows you to attach energies without placing damage counters onto your EX, so then you can come in with a 20 damage EX, which can't be loss impacted, and you can bait out their Star Requiem. Now, when you're making this kind of play, it's crucial that your Cresselia is doing 100 damage. If you can't do 100 damage with your Cresselia, you just need to knock out your opponent's Comfey. Now that we've talked about the approaches Tina will take to this matchup and how you should respond to them, I'm going to touch on the key resources you should be looking to preserve in order to make good plays in the late game. The number one resource you're going to be looking to conserve is path outs. Now, all of them are essential, especially Collapse Stadium is one of my favorites. It lets you remove damaged Pokemon from your board, and you can always lose the game to Path Roxanne at the end, so it's really important to have your deck saturated with these outs to Path to the Peak. Additionally, ways to recycle Pokemon, both from your discard and from play, are very important. Now, Turo is a great card in this matchup because in the start of the game, you might need to use a Radiant Greninja, or a Manaphy, or a Lumineon, or maybe you just start with any of these Pokemon. Or Screamtail, you could start with Screamtail, that's another poor Pokemon to have on the board, and it's really nice to be able to pick these Pokemon up with Turo at some point in the game and free up a bench spot for another Ralts. Super Rod as well is really important because you want to be attacking with Cresselia multiple times, and when your Refinement Kirlias die, it's really important to Super Rod them back in so that you can set them up again. And the last resource I'm going to say is really important is Gusting Effects. Now, sometimes Countercatcher is included as a Gusting Effect, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes your Tina opponent will chill at 2 prizes at the end of the game until they can find a Boss's Orders on your Gardevoir EX, meaning that you can't Countercatcher for your last 2 prizes on a Tina VSTAR. So it's really important that you have access to Boss's Orders in your deck. Now, if you use Boss's Orders early in the game or you discard it, really look for Palpad to get it back into your deck, as you will likely need a Boss's Orders to close out the game. From the Tina perspective, resource conservation is also very important. Now, in a way, their whole deck is almost a resource. They have cards that draw them cards, and they have resources such as energies, Mirage Gates, Super Rods, Boss's Orders, stuff like that. So, a lot of the time, they're going to be making awkward loss zones, which you need to adapt to. For example, if you notice that your opponent loss zones a water energy or 2 water energies, at that point, I wouldn't put down Manaphy. They can't use Radiant Greninja. Similarly, if you notice that they lost zone Sableye, I mostly give my opponents credit for 1 Sableye, so if you see that Sableye go to the lost zone, don't bench Jirachi. You don't need it. You can have an extra bench space, you can put down another Ralts, which is really going to spike your board later in the game when you have an extra Kirlia. Additionally, these ways to draw cards are big resources. Every time they play a Colress or a Jet Energy, your Ionos become more powerful. They have less cards in their deck that draw them more cards. Even if they're the greatest resource conservation mastermind ever, at the end of the game, if they have all resources in their deck, they're not going to be able to find the right ones in the right moments. And then the final resource that they have is Path Roxanne. So if you notice that they put both of their Roxannes or multiple Path to the Peaks in the loss zone, adapt. Prioritize your stadiums less, prioritize your deck less. Now, these things can still be important, but especially once you notice that all of their path, maybe you see 3 or 4 Path to the Peaks in their discard and loss zone, now you're not so worried about path. You can adjust your play knowing that you'll be able to Psychic Embrace on your next play. So, in conclusion, my biggest tip for this matchup is to not stress about the prize trade. Now, you're going to fall behind, but the biggest thing to worry about is the board state. Worry about how many Kirlias you have in play, how protected they are, how good the Tina board is. What is the strongest part of their board? If they have Comfies with energies on them, you're going to want to kill those, remove them from the board, remove the amount of resources they have in play. If they have a Tina with 3 energies on the board, you're going to want to Cresselia that and clean it up with Gardevoir EX, forcing them to find new energies, new Mirage Gates. And you really just want to put as much pressure on Tina's draw as possible. You want to make them need big combos, and sometimes like attacking with Gardevoir EX can force them to hit a big like VSTAR Mirage Gate combo off of an Iono low. And then once they use that VSTAR, you can keep attacking with Gardevoir EX, and they can't deal with it. So I hope this video was informative and it taught you something about the Tina versus Guardy matchup, and I will see you guys in the next one.